Jenny Wanda Bachmann, known as the Beautiful Spectre, accurately represents female brutality in the context of National Socialist crimes. Born in the 20s in Hamburg, her life unfolded between the pursuit of a modeling career and her eventual recruitment as a guard at the Stutthof concentration camp. Despite her notorious beauty, she became for many a symbol of horror, showing extreme cruelty towards prisoners, whom she tortured and selected for the gas chambers without hesitation. Her influence in Nazi circles was notable. She was part of a system that dehumanized its victims and embodied the regime's ideology by actively participating in acts of violence and oppression. Captured after the war, she was tried and sentenced to death, leaving behind a disturbing legacy. But let's talk about her in more detail. The youth of someone who died young, early years and aspirations of grandeur. Jenny Wanda Bachmann was born on the 30th of May, 1922 in Hamburg, in what was called the Weimar Republic, during a turbulent period in German history. Hamburg, one of the main port cities of the country, was deeply affected by the economic and political instability that characterized the Weimar Republic after the First World War. The military defeat, the reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, and hyperinflation were part of the context that shaped her childhood. In her environment, social tensions were palpable, and the rise of Nazism began to gain strength among sectors of the population seeking stability and a sense of national identity. In this environment, radical nationalist ideologies and militarism began to permeate the daily lives of German families, including hers. Although specific details about her family nucleus are not well documented, it is reasonable to assume that the dynamics of the time influenced her perception of the world from an early age. When she was 10 years old, Adolf Hitler took power in 1933. A new era was about to begin in that country and on the European continent. At this age, she joined the League of German Girls. This youth and female movement, fundamental in the strategy of the new authorities to shape young Germans, aimed to instill loyalty to the Führer, exacerbated patriotism, and a strict racial consciousness. Through seemingly recreational activities such as camps and ceremonies, young girls were indoctrinated with the principles of the prevailing ideology, preparing them for their role in German society. The educational system of the time also played a key role in this indoctrination process. Schools became tools of the regime, where textbooks were modified to glorify Hitler and the Aryan race while dehumanizing those considered enemies of the state. Propaganda was omnipresent and shaped not only beliefs, but also the behaviors of the younger ones. Teachers acted as extensions of the government, inculcating obedience and a worldview centered on racial supremacy. And in general, the social pressure to conform to the norms imposed by Nazism was intense. Young people were not only watched, but also incentivized to report any behavior in their homes or communities that could be interpreted as subversive. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance that eroded family and personal relationships, replacing them with absolute loyalty to the state. Moreover, the League of German Girls also taught its members their role as future mothers of the Aryan race, responsible for ensuring racial purity and strengthening the system being built. Through physical activities, ideological speeches, and a hierarchical structure that mimicked military discipline, young girls were prepared to meet the regime's expectations. As Bachmann grew up, the impact of this environment became more evident in her personal and moral development. The combination of family influence, school indoctrination, and membership in the League of German Girls contributed to consolidating a worldview that prioritized obedience to the Führer over universal ethical values. But this young woman stood out from the beginning for her beauty, and during these same years, she cultivated aspirations of becoming a fashion model or actress. In the course of the 1930s, she participated in photo sessions for German magazines, which seemed to indicate a promising future in the entertainment world. However, by the late 1930s, Germany was completely immersed in Nazi ideology, and the Third Reich had succeeded in integrating its doctrine into all aspects of daily life. After the start of the Second World War, a new facet of her life opened up inevitably. Paths of War, the transformation of a young artist in Germany in 1944. Despite her inclinations towards the world of entertainment, With the onset of the conflict in 1939 and the progressive militarization of German society, job and artistic opportunities began to drastically diminish. As the war progressed, Hamburg, like other German cities, experienced the effects of the conflict in both economic and social terms. Although the economic situation of her family at that time is not known, it is possible to infer that, like many Germans of her time, Bachmann faced serious economic difficulties. The Weimar Germany was a period characterized by severe inflation and unemployment, which affected many families. Therefore, by 1944, at the age of 21, Bachmann decided to definitively abandon her ambitions in the world of entertainment and chose to respond to an SS advertisement. This call sought women to work as Aufseherinnen, or female guards, in the concentration camps, due to the growing need for personnel in the Nazi oppression system. The recruitment process she underwent began with a simple application through the advertisement. After being selected, she participated in a brief interview in which she highlighted her willingness to assume the responsibilities demanded by the regime. Her acceptance was followed by an intensive 10-day training designed specifically for women who would occupy supervisory roles in the camps. This training program had a clear focus: to prepare future female guards for the harsh conditions of the concentration camps, to instill the prevailing ideology in them, and to morally justify the barbarities that would be committed against the prisoners. Her decision to join the SS was influenced by various factors reflecting both her personal circumstances and the socio-political context of the time. In reality, her transition from a young woman with artistic aspirations to a guard in one of the most brutal concentration camps of the imposed system cannot be understood solely as an individual choice. Firstly, the economic difficulties faced by Germany during the war made the economic offer of the SS an attractive option. The salary offered was considerably higher than she could have obtained in any other occupation at that time, especially after leaving modeling. Additionally, the promise of stability and an apparent professional advancement amid the uncertainty of the conflict represented another important motivation. Bachmann, like many other women who responded to these calls, found in the concentration camp system an opportunity to redefine her personal trajectory and escape the economic and social limitations imposed by the war. Finally, although difficult to confirm, it has been speculated that she might have been attracted by the power dynamics inherent in the role she would play. After all, she had already been part of the League of German Girls. Nazism was not indifferent to her from before. The possibility of exercising authority and control, especially in a brutal environment like the concentration camps, might have represented an additional attraction for someone seeking to transcend the limitations of the life she was leaving behind. After completing her training, she was assigned to the Stutthof concentration camp located in Poland. There she began to fulfill her role as a guard, quickly gaining notoriety for her cruel treatment of prisoners. Guardians of Horror: Women in the Stutthof concentration camp. The Stutthof concentration camp was established in a wooded area west of the village of Stutowo, near Gdansk, Poland, in the year 1939, becoming one of the first concentration camps of the Nazi regime outside the borders of Germany. It began as a small camp, known as the Old Camp, surrounded by barbed wire and composed of 8 barracks for prisoners, as well as a kommandantur for the SS guards. In 1943, the camp was expanded with the construction of a new sector that included 30 additional barracks and was protected by electrified fences. The total area of the camp reached approximately 1.2 square kilometers. Its main objective was the detention, exploitation, and eventual extermination of prisoners, mostly Poles and Jews. During the years of its operation, the conditions inside the camp reflected the characteristic brutality of the German government of that context, with frequent deaths caused by executions, diseases, and forced labor. In the early years, Stutthof did not have facilities for mass executions, but by 1944 a crematorium and gas chambers were built, facilitating the systematic annihilation of thousands of prisoners. Throughout its existence, it is estimated that more than 115,000 people were imprisoned there, coming from various countries occupied by the Nazis. In the year prior to the end of the Second World War, at the height of its activity, the camp housed approximately 57,000 captives. Living conditions were deplorable, marked by overcrowded barracks, lack of hygiene, and insufficient food. Diseases, especially typhus, spread rapidly among the inmates, claiming countless lives. In this context, the camp staff included both men and women. Among the female guards, known as SS Aufseherinnen, around 130 women served at Stutthof over the years. These women, recruited due to the shortage of male personnel in the SS, played a crucial role in the surveillance and control of prisoners. Many of them were trained in camps like Ravensbrück, where they were indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and prepared for the extreme conditions of their work. Among the most notorious female guards was Jenny Wanda Bachmann. At just 21 years old, she became an Aufseherin. This young woman quickly distinguished herself for her extreme cruelty towards prisoners. She was known for inflicting severe physical punishments, even beating some to death. Her favorite instrument for inflicting pain on others was her belt. Most of the time, she would not calm down until it started to turn scarlet. A bruise was not enough. Blood had to make an appearance. Similarly, she demanded that other inmates witness the gruesome spectacle. She also actively participated in selections for the gas chambers. The process involved deciding who was considered too weak to work, and, as they were no longer deemed useful, they were sent to their deaths. It was said that Jenny not only inflicted physical suffering, but also seemed to enjoy the power she had over the captives. On several occasions, she was seen laughing out loud while administering punishments or sending people to their deaths. For her, their tears and gestures of pain were a visual delight. It was said that her most frequent victims were adult women and teenagers. Some witnesses even claimed to have seen her beating children and mothers with their newborns, but she was not the only prominent female figure. Hertha Botha was trained at Ravensbrück and then joined the staff at Stutthof. During her time at the camp, she frequently beat prisoners for minor infractions, using her authority to humiliate and subdue. In the last months of the war, she took part in the so-called death marches, in which she forced prisoners to walk long distances under inhumane conditions, resulting in the death of many of them. Another was Elisabeth Becker. Her main role was to accompany the condemned to the gas chambers, where she personally selected women and children to be exterminated. She was recognized for the coldness with which she carried out these tasks, showing herself impassive to the fate of the people she sent to their deaths. The third, Gerda Steinhoff, supervised groups of prisoners and actively participated in selections for the gas chambers. Like the others, she was known for her brutality, using physical violence as a tool to maintain control over the inmates. Deadly attraction: how a beautiful young woman inspired terror in Stutthof. Bachmann's physical appearance, described as attractive and youthful, captured the attention of those around her and sharply contrasted with the acts of cruelty that would define her life in the following years. From a very young age, due to her features, it was clear she would become an attractive lady. Her dark hair, which she generally wore styled to accentuate her femininity, was one of the traits that most drew attention to her. In historical photographs, her hairstyle reflects a carefully maintained aesthetic, contributing to her captivating image. Her face was young and finely featured, giving her an air of delicacy. However, as a guard, she always had a cold or indifferent expression. This suggests that it was not easy to make her smile. Probably those who had the chance to see her happy knew that even her perfectly aligned teeth were captivating. As for her figure, she is described as slim and fragile. Her youth and beauty were undeniably striking, standing out even more in an environment marked by suffering and violence. Despite her youth, she soon earned a fearsome reputation. Her nickname, Beautiful Spectre, not only reflected her appearance but also the terrifying combination of her beauty with ruthless behavior towards prisoners. This contrast always drew the attention of both her colleagues and the inmates, generating a bewilderment that would persist even after the war. Her lack of empathy and the apparent pleasure she derived from these acts set her apart even from other guards who shared her duties. The impact of her actions did not go unnoticed among her colleagues, who commented on the extent of her cruelty. Some reports indicate that even other guards, accustomed to the inherent brutality of the system, were surprised by the sadism with which she performed her duties. This behavior, combined with her disdainful attitude and lack of remorse, solidified her reputation as a particularly feared figure within the camp. Among the prisoners, Bachmann inspired a mixture of terror and hatred. The selections for the gas chambers, one of the most infamous tasks she participated in, were moments of absolute horror. where her mere presence generated panic among the inmates. It is not difficult to understand why. Her uniform, like that of the other female guards in the concentration camp, was emblematic and combined authority and oppression. It consisted of a fitted black jacket adorned with SS insignia on the shoulders, which accentuated her figure. Under the jacket, she wore a white or grey shirt, creating a marked contrast with the black of the uniform. The black belt she wore included a buckle with the double S emblem, adding a distinctive and symbolic touch to her attire. Finally, the high black leather boots completed her appearance, being practical for the camp terrain and reinforcing her authoritative image. The fall of the beautiful Spectre, her attempt to escape and capture. At the end of the Second World War, Jenny Wanda Bachmann, a figure known for her role as a guard in the concentration camp, found herself caught in a series of events that would mark her downfall and capture. With the military situation in her country deteriorating rapidly and the Stutthof concentration camp in its final phase, she escaped and went into hiding, beginning a period of several weeks during which she managed to evade capture. The Red Army was advancing, dismantling the Führer's power wherever it passed, and by then, Jenny's dark reign in the camp had lasted barely a year. During this time, she used various methods to hide her identity and whereabouts, moving through different locations and relying on the help of strangers who temporarily protected her. However, as the war drew to a close, the likelihood of being captured increased, and with it, the pressure to abandon the areas where she had found refuge. At some point in the spring of 1945, she attempted to flee even further from the conflict region. She headed towards the city of Gdansk in Poland, intending to take a train that would carry her beyond the reach of Allied and Soviet forces. Unfortunately for her, her plan was thwarted when, in May of that same year, she was arrested by the Polish militia at a train station in the same city. Her arrest was not coincidental. In the months leading up to her capture, news of her brutality as a guard had been widely disseminated among the camp's survivors. Many of them had witnessed her atrocities and, upon learning that someone with her appearance was fleeing justice, began to spread her description. When Bachmann attempted to board the train, some of those same survivors recognized her, which facilitated her capture. After being arrested, she was taken to a detention center where her interrogation began. Her case was part of the first Stutthof trial, aimed at holding those involved in all the injustices committed in the concentration camp of the same name accountable. This trial, which began in 1946, focused on several former guards and officers of the camp, where it is estimated that about 60,000 prisoners lost their lives due to executions and dire living conditions. Bachmann was one of the most prominent defendants in this trial, known for her extreme cruelty in her role as an Aufseherin in the camp. The trial attracted considerable public attention, as numerous survivors of the camp were called to testify against her, recounting experiences of violence and systematic murders. During the proceedings, dozens of survivors provided detailed testimonies about the actions of the guard, describing how she mercilessly beat the captives and selected those who would be executed. The trial aimed not only to deliver justice, but also to serve as a historical record of the horrors experienced by the prisoners in Stutthof. The laughter of infamy, Bachmann's flirtation and disdain in the courtroom. As a consequence of her capture, the trial took place in a context of great pain and suffering for the survivors, who faced the difficult task of recalling the atrocities that had been committed against them. From the beginning of the trial, the accused showed a surprisingly indifferent attitude towards the serious accusations against her, despite the shocking statements from the survivors, who recounted the abuses and murders she had orchestrated. She seemed completely uninterested in the suffering of the victims. Instead of showing remorse or concern for the evidence presented against her, she was often seen smiling, laughing mockingly, and even flirting with the guards present in the room. This behavior, inappropriate for the gravity of the trial, was particularly disconcerting for the witnesses and the public following the case. In reality, that spectacle was another nail in her coffin. It only further alienated her from the court and the public, who were already deeply outraged by her crimes. While the survivors recounted harrowing experiences of the brutality of the guards at Stutthof, Bachmann seemed to treat the trial as a spectacle, paying more attention to her appearance. and how she styled her hair than to the accusations made against her. Her behavior was always characterized by equal and absolute contempt towards the court and the victims. She neither asked for forgiveness nor showed remorse for her crimes. On the contrary, faced with the evidence demonstrating her brutality, such as the testimonies of prisoners describing how she beat the inmates and selected those who would be executed, she tried to deny her guilt. In her defense, she claimed that she had treated the Jewish captives well, even asserting that she had saved some lives. However, these claims were met with skepticism by both the survivors and the court, as they were in clear contradiction with the overwhelming evidence presented against her. The defense strategy was weak. Her lawyer admitted her guilt but tried to mitigate her responsibility by claiming that his client suffered from a mental illness. This argument attempted to mitigate her guilt, presenting her actions as the result of psychological instability rather than inherent evil, suggesting that no sane person could commit such crimes. However, this argument did not have the desired effect, as the judicial community and the public were not swayed by the insanity defense given the nature of the evidence and the behavior of the accused. Her lack of a coherent defense and her absolute indifference to the testimonies against her worked against her, ultimately undermining any attempt to mitigate her guilt. One of Bachmann's most disturbing interventions during the trial was her comment upon receiving the death sentence by hanging. Upon hearing the sentence, she simply said, "Life is truly a pleasure, and pleasures are usually short." This statement, without any hint of remorse, revealed a disconcerting disconnection from reality, as well as a total lack of awareness of the magnitude of her crimes. Instead of showing any form of remorse for the suffering she had caused, she accepted her fate with chilling coldness. Similarly, her behavior during the process sheds a disturbing light on her psychology. Her lack of remorse, it was said, seemed to reflect traits such as narcissism and psychopathy. People with these characteristics are often unable to empathize with the suffering of others, which allows them to act cruelly without feeling compassion. In her case, her indifference and focus on trivial aspects during the hearings indicate a deep belief in her own superiority and a total disconnection from the consequences of her actions. Additionally, the mocking laughter she exhibited upon hearing the victims' testimonies could be interpreted as a defense mechanism, a way to emotionally distance herself from the cruelties she had committed. Likewise, from the beginning of the process, she demonstrated a defiant attitude towards the court and the witnesses, showing very little interest in the accusations presented. A rope tightening around a neck, the relentless end of an executioner. On the 4th of July of the same year the trial took place. That woman was executed by hanging in a public execution in Gdansk, Poland. This act marked a crucial moment in the history of post-war justice, symbolizing both the punishment for the crimes committed under the Nazi regime and society's desire to close the wounds left by the Second World War. Bachmann, along with 10 co-defendants, all former guards of the Stutthof concentration camp, was sentenced to death for her participation in the atrocities committed in that place, where it is estimated that thousands died due to forced labor, hunger, diseases, and executions. The execution took place on Biskupia Gorka Hill, a place that became a scene loaded with symbolism. Thousands of spectators gathered to witness the event, which had been previously announced in the newspapers, increasing the anticipation among the population. For many of those present, the execution was not only the punishment against her, but also a form of collective revenge for the suffering inflicted on thousands of people in camps like Stutthof. The event was also witnessed by prisoners who had been liberated from the camp, adding an emotional and symbolic impact to the execution. These witnesses, who had once been victims, now found themselves observing the fate of those responsible for their suffering. The crowd reacted with a mix of emotions, between cries for revenge and exclamations of justice, reflecting both the pain for the losses suffered and the relief at seeing one of the responsible parties pay for her crimes. Some members of the crowd tore pieces of clothing and buttons from the bodies of the condemned, reflecting a need to appropriate macabre mementos of the event. In a context where Europe was still recovering from the horrors of the Holocaust, the event represented an explicit rejection of the ideologies that had allowed such brutalities. The execution was also interpreted as an act of symbolic justice in the context of Europe's moral and social reconstruction. After the years of occupation and the war crimes perpetrated by the regime, the execution of figures like Bachmann offered a sense of restoring moral order. However, there were also those who questioned the way justice was being carried out. Some critics suggested that public executions, although symbolic, could divert attention from the need for a deeper judicial process involving the reconstruction of societies devastated by the war. The division between the desire for punishment and the process of social reconciliation and healing was palpable at the time. The testimonies of survivors who attended the execution served to confirm the need to hold accountable for the crimes committed. This event also highlighted the challenges of post-war justice. While steps were taken towards accountability, the complications of a judicial process amid Europe's reconstruction were evident. Public executions, although symbolic, were not always sufficient to heal the deep wounds left by the war.